Welcome to Brandon Hall Group's HCMx Radio, the only podcast in the HCM arena that weaves current market research, HR technology, and industry leaders into each episode. Our HCMx Radio host is our Chief Operating Officer and Principal HCM Analyst, Rachel Cook.
Hello, hi, I'm Rachel Cook. I'm the COO at Brandon Hall Group and the host of our podcast, HCMx Radio. It's great to be here today. Also with me, I have Michael Rochelle, our Chief Strategy Officer and one of our principals. Hey, Michael.
Good morning.
And good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone. Good evening for those of you that may be in other places than us in Florida. And we also have with us today, Todd Moran. Hi. Hey, Todd, how are you?
Greetings, Rachel, Michael. Great to get some time with both of you.
Great to have you. And Todd is the Chief Learning Strategist at Novo Ed. And so we're excited to be talking today about upskilling and reskilling, especially in today's time, or what companies and everyone really had to endure over the last couple of years here and trying to figure out new roles and shifting people around to hopefully retain their people and put them in positions that they may not have been in order to scale and to continue the momentum in their organization. And to get started, Todd, could you share a little bit more about your background? You have a fascinating history, and so I think it's better coming from you than from me.
No, happy to, Rachel. So I date myself a little bit here. I don't know that I've been in the space quite as long as Michael and sort of pedigree, but the better part of 23 years or so working in L&D talent HR. And for the first significant portion of that 10, 12 plus years, I was on the customer side. So running large scale L&D teams, executing on external services work, and then spent a long stint at Schneider Electric running their Office of Digital Transformation. How do you take a 175-year-old French firm that makes gray boxes and pivot them into the nature of digitization and a world around software and services and upskilling, reskilling, multiple generations, that operated in 100 different countries. And so I shifted out of the customer side and joined the provider side of the house about 8 years ago and got heavily involved in the communication collaboration space and did a long stint at Jive Software, sort of a leader in that social business as it was termed at the time, and before Microsoft Teams was sort of on and Slack sort of came into the mix. And then more recently, I spent a little bit of time at EdCast running strategy and solutioning for that learning experience platform provider. And I've been with Novo Ed here now for just about 11 months, coming up on my 1-year anniversary. So a little bit of both sides of the aisle, if you will.
And you kind of jumped in with them at an interesting time, I'm sure.
Indeed, yeah, sort of right at sort of partially into pandemic, and this idea of just as you opened with Rachel, wrestling with and Michael, all that you have consulted so many firms on is the idea of how do we change and pivot around what is no longer a modality of ILT that was so prominent around educating and reskilling and upskilling, not just soft skills but technical skills, that just absolutely evaporated in March of 2020. And what do you do? Where do you go from there? So it's interesting times, and now here we are 18 plus months later, and I don't think folks get to be surprised anymore. They don't get to claim that, not as L&D talent professionals.
Right, and so let's start a little bit around what is your perspective as it relates to upskilling and reskilling.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there's been such a wave, and certainly I've lived this on the customer side with some of the firms I've worked with. Pre-Schneider at Schneider, it was a huge focus. It has become an absolute dominant, centralized focal point for large-scale enterprises across the globe, and rightly so. And we talk about the nature of the shelf life of skills being sort of 2 to 3 years, and people talking about having 6-decade-long careers is becoming the norm now. the level of job change is astronomical in having to address that, not to mention the multiple generations in the workforce. So I think the focus is right to be putting this high degree of emphasis on skills and maybe less so about traditional roles. I think where we might be missing the mark a little bit is this focal point on just the idea of, if I think of a sort of skill, and would love to get your perspective here, Michael, if you think my definitions are off base, but if skill is that construct around knowledge of topic or system, where I think the bigger emphasis should be is on the capability side. And it's not just semantics, the way that we think about it, or I think about it, is the capability, is the ability to demonstrate that in a job setting. And so this idea of taking knowledge, information, and being able to translate that into job performance, I think is where we should all be hyper focused on, and not just taxonomies and specificity to personalized learning around these set individual discrete topics of skills, but can you demonstrate those in a true work setting? And if so, that's a little bit of the North Star for, I think, for folks, not just about the taxonomies or folksonomies or iterations of evolved competency models that have sort of progressive sets of nodes of skills, if you will. So a little bit about my perspective on that front, Rachel.
Michael, is there anything you would like to expand on? I think Todd keyed in on some of the critical elements. Is there anything else?
Well, I mean, it's definitely borne out in our research. In the recent study that we did, 85 to 90% of companies said that they need to have their learning be individual and business outcome focused. So they get it, and they know that personalized learning is part of that journey. I think one of the things you bring up, though, that's interesting, just to kind of expand on your ideas, skills and competencies, take two different paths with learning too. And I think companies are coming around to that. I like your thought that, capability is building potential in someone, developing someone's, future and current potential. Skills is like for the now, so to speak. So I think as we look at the future of work, and our research shows that only 50% of companies believe that their current approach to learning really gets them in the right position for future work, which is going to be all about the potential of people, what they could do with minimal learning. How can they jump in and contribute? I think you're spot on with all of your observations.
We talk a lot about the individual and personalized learning. How do you also, how do you develop the organizational capabilities?
Yeah, it's a challenging one. It's really interesting because a lot of the focal point, when I was living and breathing in the LXP space, right, is that so much of this focus on democratizing learning. You can be your own CLO. You can go out and sort of anything that you wish to sort of learn and edify and educate upon, it's sort of at your disposal, and we will do this universal aggregation and discovery, and they are wildly powerful pieces of technology. Make no mistake about it. I think the challenge is if that is done purely in isolation and it's not sort of reflective of a larger team dynamic or constructs that are critical to the firm across an entire geo or tied to an entire sort of set of functional entities, it just becomes individual pursuit of knowledge. Not a bad thing, but I don't know, again, back to Michael, your point, does that really help move the needle on some things around job performance and productivity and efficiency and top line revenue and operational excellence? Those are pieces that have to happen, beyond just individual pursuit of knowledge and discrete skills. And so I think one of the big ways, Rachel, we see a lot of our clients trying to tackle this is bringing together the power of learning together, this idea of this pure construct, and trying to collectively upskill entire swaths of a workforce population means they have to spend some time together. And if they can't do that in a setting face-to-face in sort of offices around the world anymore, at least not as the common norm, because hybrid is here to stay, then what does that look like and what form does that take? But the idea of creating those opportunities for shared experiences, not exclusively in sort of virtual setting, but driven a lot by that, so that you can scale that over different time zones and geographically dispersed entities, becomes, I think, part of that key to unlocking not just individual, but doing that at a much larger group, team, business unit, sort of geographic footprint level.
Would you also advise on some kind of framework how do you bridge the connection between the individualized, and it may be kind of redundant to what I just asked, and organizational capabilities, but how do you create a framework where or transparency that shows the goals and the objectives or the learning outcomes from the individual, and how does that tie into the performance of the organization? What is your suggested approach or framework? Because there is a lot, and you can, obviously, let's say, for example, you have a call center or you had a storefront, and during the pandemic, no one could go into the store. So you had to move everybody that was comfortable with in-person interactions to perhaps virtual or telecommunication, and maybe that's just a different skill set for some. So that's kind of easy, I think, but there's so much, I feel, that, what are some of the things that companies aren't considering that you saw in some of your clients, and how did you approach, or what kind of strategic guidelines or process would you recommend?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest areas that sort of stems from is being really purposeful, intentional design about those areas of critical focus. So as folks had to make these pivots, over the last 18 months, and they're saying, wow, we need to put a much greater degree of emphasis on universal leadership across the company and developing things around adaptability and resiliency and empathetic listening. And we have to do that at scale because this change is going to be sustained over a period of time. So the idea of being really intentional about the types of skills moving to capabilities that you want to target is probably step one. The second piece of that, I think, is enlisting, and this is something that's been a long challenge of L&D, is oftentimes order takers, right? What does the business need? What's that training intervention to sort of address a sort of an isolated incident? And now I think what you're seeing is, in our clients that were most successful in this, is saying, listen, we have to change the fundamental paradigm of L&D, HR, and talent, and now we are here as true partners of the business. So what are those critical challenges? Do you need to reskill an entire set of customer service folks? Do we need to cascade the nature of these 4 or 5 critical skills to capabilities across leadership at all levels of the org? Then we'll partner with you to do that. We'll do some very intentional design in some of our program and learning, and it won't just be throwing content assets upon content assets at our entire workforce population in hope that they can make that sort of progression to collective, individual capability building across the org. So that intentionality, I think, is number one, and then this idea of much closer partnership with what are those critical needs and initiatives of the business, and getting close to those in a granular fashion.
Okay, that's helpful to think of that.
I think it's a great way to think about it, and organizational capability, I think, is oftentimes overlooked, as an outcome. When you talk to a chief learning officer, at least the Fortune 50s will say, if you ask them what's their job, and their job, they don't say is to develop better learning. They say is to raise the level of potential of the talent within the organization through learning. So they have that organizational capability, talent readiness to meet the challenge opportunity, but I think it has to get deeper into other organizations. If you don't have a CLO, you still have to have the same mindset, and it starts with someone at the top saying, "Learning isn't for the sake of learning. It's for organizational capability." But we even see it in the certification programs we offer. Like, we have competencies that have to do with you and I learning an individual competency that we can demonstrate, but then there's all these other organizational count. You have to be able to do something with it. You run an initiative or improve a customer satisfaction score and lead a team to do that, or all the things you talked about. So I think your focus on use cases that are happening in companies every day, and how do you apply learning in the flow of work to achieve those outcomes through, use case development and demonstrating it. That's the best practice, I think, now.
Yeah, I think that the idea, Michael, of shifting, sort of beyond just learning efficacy, like you said, that's not what the CLOs are talking about. Like, yes, everyone wants better learning and more engaged learning, but to what end? In pursuit of what? And that I think is the question that the organizations should be asking themselves, far more often, far more meaningfully in support of the business.
Right.
Yeah, it needs to, it really needs to align with the objectives of what what's the bottom line for the business to perform, and then how do you map that to your learning priorities, or because a lot of learning professionals react to situations, to challenges, to poor production, but in order for that to be more effective, is to make sure that it is always aligning to the business. And, it's fun though to test out some of these new approaches. And, I think tools out there have been easier to access and cheaper. They're not as cost prohibiting. You don't have to necessarily be a developer in order to produce a great program. So that's exciting because there's a lot of flexibility there that companies can have and learning professionals can have. And it all goes back to reskilling, right? And upskilling.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think the other piece that really stands out, and I'd be intrigued. I don't know if some of this surfaced, Michael, and I know that some of the upskilling, reskilling research you all had done a little bit earlier in the year. But this idea of so much of the focus on the workforce population, and rightly so. But what do the internal L&D, HR, and talent teams need to do with their own reskilling efforts in support? So if it's going to be a new paradigm of content creation, of partnering with the business, of putting together purposefully and intentionally designed experiences, moving from classic instructor, sage on stage, to more of guide on the side, and really upping their skills and capabilities in the realm of virtual facilitation. Like, how do they do that, and should that be a focal point? So I think oftentimes it's a little bit of that the idea that the own internal teams need to also kind of collectively upskill and reskill their games in support of them powering and fueling some of those big organizational changes for the rest of the workforce population.
Yeah, I think you're right.
We most definitely, and we saw that even in the role of the learning and how it's being deployed, where you really have to, there's so much we see in companies that they have so much content, they have so many resources, but they lack the communication or the the production, the marketing of it. So that's another element that is critical, because it's a shame if you create something and no one knows that it's there, or they don't know the benefit of it. So that's another piece that learning has to be responsible, or figure out, how to communicate, and share the value of it.
Yeah,
I think you're right, Todd. Our research did show a couple things. To your point, one is the organizations that said they're less prepared for the future of work with their learning, they cited that they felt as though their processes were more traditional in their approach to developing learning. They're using traditional instructional design methods, for example, like versus, LLMA or SAM or some of the other ones that are out there. So you're absolutely right. It becomes a significant challenge for them. In fact, 50% of companies actually said that their current capabilities within their L&D department is what's holding them up from making the case and delivering personalized learning. So you're spot on. Yeah, you're spot on from the data that we took a look at.
Well, this has certainly been an interesting discussion, timely and critical. Todd, what would you recommend, as we leave today, if someone's kind of rethinking their approach here? What are some of the guidelines or tips that you'd offer?
Yeah, maybe we'll try to do three quick ones. So I think the first is, if you're not close to your business leaders, get close to them. Figure out what's really keeping them up at night. What are those biggest challenges? Don't wait for that request to come in to say, I need to develop 500 new agile project managers. Why? What's the need? How does that tie to our critical initiatives for our 5-year plan? Get close to That's probably the first and foremost. The second is there's a ton of technology out there. So be mindful. There's a lot that you can do with what you have in house, and being creative and clever with sort of leveraging kind of your existing nature of your tech stack, but also recognize you might have some gaps. And that's a piece where, being thoughtful and really purposeful about how you're building that ecosystem for the sustained effort. If your charter is that of sustaining talent and capability over long periods of time, make sure that you've got the right tools and systems in place to do that. And then the third one I think I would offer is get creative about how you're staffing your teams. I think we're seeing some of our customers that have had the most wild success over these past 18 months of grappling with the nature of the pandemic and its total tumultuous approach on learning and development, have really rethought how they organize their teams. Do you really need more instructional designers, or is it experienced designers? Do you need folks that just sort of lightly understand analytics, or do you want folks that really are sort of data analysts at heart and can mash up different data inputs from learning to business, et cetera, creating these sort of centers of excellence, again, in support of the business, but maybe some less traditional, having folks that know how to do comms and marketing exceedingly well inside of learning. Those are big pieces. So a little bit long-winded, but maybe those are the three I'd leave folks with.
Well, it's great advice. Michael, is there anything that you'd like to end today with?
I'll make one plug. I don't think we talked enough about technology. And so I think it's an important piece. And again, I'll just cite the research again that, 2/3 of companies feel the way they're going to get get through this learning crisis is through better tech. But 60% of companies think that they don't have the right tech. So you can't scale. You can't upskill and reskill at scale without having a great technology ecosystem. And I know that your team offers one of the best in the industry. So it's a key consideration. And it's one that we have to keep thinking about. It's great to be able to get great people in place and build great processes, but how do you do that across 3 continents, 10 languages, 8 time zones? You need technology to scale it.
And we saw
Without
that this last year too, when we were doing our pulse surveys on the pandemic, and the companies that kept their momentum and that were able to effortlessly or transition their training into virtual. Some companies they reported they did not have any loss or any downtime. They went seamlessly into delivering their training, and they actually had, I think, greater results and more. Some of them had more attendance in some of these, forums and events and virtual events. So, and the key was having technology. And I think those that already had it in place, not to say if you're not there yet that you cannot be there. It's just a little bit of a longer, a longer path for you. But those that were kind of midway or halfway, they just increased their, it really kind of increased their efforts. So it's great. And I agree with Michael. NovoEd, great technology. So thank you, Todd, for joining us and sharing your perspectives on an interesting topic. And Michael, always fun having you on with me today. So thank you both. Have a great afternoon or a great day ahead.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Rachel. Have a good day, everybody.
Take care.